Well, it sounds to me like, you were a bunch of young kids, had a super success real fast, and then reality hit. The real world kind of settled in there a little bit, right?
Well, I mean, that happened all the time. I mean, you know, it just was we were really caught up in the business of it. I mean, all of the social stuff and all the touring and so forth, yes, goes along with it. But I mean, our main problems were really driven by the fact that we had a record contract, and that record contract forced us to make records, and we were with a record company who made its living with us. And there were White Whale Records, this small record company that we had signed with in 1965, never had any other artists. I mean, the Beatles had Capitol Records. I mean, the Beatles had the same record company as, the Beach Boys and Frank Sinatra and on and on. I mean, just like Paul Revere and the Raiders was with CBS Records, like the Byrds were with CBS Records. All of these groups had the ability to function in a major label that had mucho dinero, a lot of money behind those groups. The Turtles were with a very small independent record company, and there was no other groups on White Whale Records. And so we were forced to sort of function under the guidelines of a record company that didn't really know what they were doing. And we were trying to find our, personality as an artist, as an act, while trying to have hit records so that the record company could continue to maintain its equilibrium. So there was a lot of pressure on us.
Well, the reality of the industry kind of set in and, in a way, kind of ruined a good thing in some respects.
Well, I think the reality of the situation didn't really set in. It sort of grew around us, because it's easy to say set in now because we're looking back at it. But at the time, we were what the music business was all about. And when you look back and say, well, here's what went wrong in the music business, we are that group that you talk about. I mean, you might not. It's sort of a metaphor when you talk about the history of popular music and groups that were taken advantage of and groups that didn't know what they were doing, groups that signed bad contracts, groups that didn't know about publishing and ownership and copyrights and all of the elements that the music business grew up taking advantage of bands. We were that group, see? There was no music business before us. I mean, it was just record business taking from artists, and that's what we became. And that's why, I mean, when you look at the Beatles and the fact that ATI and Michael Jackson owns their publishing, they were that group too. They were those young boys who needed money and sold their publishing. Nowadays, that doesn't happen because there is history. There is history to look back and say, well, look at all these groups that got taken advantage of. We were that group.
It was a really rough time for you guys there, and not only you, but as you say, a lot of groups were being taken advantage of by unscrupulous record industry individuals. Yeah. I'm going to jump ahead and in a way kind of jump back because you've already mentioned it, but I wanted to give it its own little special time because it's special to me. Your experience with Frank Zappa and the Mothers. I grew up in a small little town in Oklahoma, and when I heard Just Another Band from L.A. and Billy the Mountain and all of that, I had it on 8-track. That's how old I am. And you guys blew me away. It was so wonderful. It was so wonderful. The vocals, I mean, I was already a Mothers fan and everything, but when you guys jumped in there was a whole new energy, a vitality that took place that was just amazing. And I got to ask you to comment on a couple of situations here. And I know they might be a little bit touchy, but you still got to comment on for me if you would please. The Smoke on the Water song, Deep Purple. Do you remember that?
Well, of course, yeah.
Oh,
it's a very vivid day still in my memory. let's start this out by saying that understandably our relationship with Frank was different than many of the other band members who had ever been preceded us and who came along after us, because Frank, to that point, had always been the leader, and everybody else was just a work-for-hire musician who really had not really done anything in the music business. When Howard and I were brought into the group, he was bringing in two people into an organization that had, in terms of success, much more success than he had. We had 4 or 5 records in the top 10 and 10 records in the top 20 and had sold millions of records. By coming over to Frank, who had really sold a few 100,000 records at that time, was probably the darling of the FM radio music audience, and we were this AM radio staple. And so it really was a dichotomy, and if you look at it in its grandiose form, I mean, there's nothing more. The 180-degree elements here really are open up for some absolute interesting creative potential. And I think that for Frank, it started out kind of innocently because he was looking at the tour ahead as the first step. And I think in this period for Frank Zappa of the Turtles, Flo and Eddie being with Frank Zappa, can be viewed by Zappa fans as the worst thing that ever happened, some, and by others as one of the best periods. And in my surveying it, I can see both elements and understand why. Because when Frank brought us in to do a certain thing, and I don't think the fan base that Frank had up to then was privy to what Frank was aspiring to do by bringing us into the group. So many Zappa fans who don't like that period of time where we came in and really became the focal point musically and visually and lyrically and everything for that about 2.5 years, just don't understand that we were doing exactly what Frank wanted us to do. This was not a project where we were brought in and we sat down with Frank and we created this, hey, Frank, the mothers need to change and here's where we should go. It was really Frank. He brought us in singing some older songs of the mothers, gave us some new songs, and we went overseas on our first tour with this kind of innocent approach of just singing with Frank, doing old material and some new songs from Chunga's Revenge that he had given us to put into the show. And from that, Frank saw a vision, and from that vision developed the motion picture 200 Motels, Billy the Mountain, and on, Magdalena, and on and on and on. And it became our vocal capabilities that allowed Frank to move into areas as a songwriter that he was unable to move into with the singers he had previous. With that said, and I say again, understandably, for some Zappa fans, that period of Frank's history is not thought of with much love. Others, like I say, what you just said, the energy and the spirit and the vocal sound and the capabilities that we brought to the group, other Zappa fans, Mothers fans, feel it was a very strong part of the Zappa history. Now, I want to say that when I I was a fan of Frank's music. I was a fan of We're Only in It for the Money. I was a fan of Reuben and the Jets. I was a fan of Frank Zappa as a person. We had known Frank since 1965. So when we joined Frank in 1972, we were joining Frank as friends and fans. It wasn't just coming out of nowhere. I mean, we had known Frank for a number of reasons and had been at some of the early freakouts. We had seen many, many live concerts in New York, performances of Absolutely Free at the Garrick Theater, and some of the really important musical eras of Frank's life. We were there as fans, so joining Frank Zappa for us was a situation where we treated it with respect. I mean, we weren't there to change the Mothers of Invention. We were there to help perpetuate the next era of what the Mothers' vision, what Frank's vision was for the Mothers of Invention, which ultimately was moving towards the motion picture 200 Motels and the Billy the Mountain, the Fat Floating Sofa Divan, the German piece that we were creating that never got finished because of the incident that you brought up. Now, the fire in Montreux, really the culmination of this fire and the Rainbow Theater incident really were the end of our career with Frank Zappa as singers. And it all took place within about a 2-week period of time. The fire breaking out in the Montreux casino where we lost all of our equipment, and then making a decision for us all to go on to England was a financial decision that Frank really did not agree with. Frank wanted to go home after Montreux. Frank was feeling some kind of religious, moral issues based on some of the material we were singing in our show. Frank was a Roman Catholic. Frank had written this piece of music about God creating a pornography film with a pig and a girl floating in outer space on this sofa called Divan, which was, one of those crazy 22-minute pieces of music that we had learned completely in German to sing, and we studied with a linguist and learned the German translations of the music because it was a combination of English and German that we toured through Europe singing. And I think when the Montreux fire hit, Frank somehow attributed this terrible event to some sort of moral feeling that Divan was something he needed to take out of the show. I don't know if I can express this, but I think Frank felt that a little bit guilty about what this piece of music was about, and Frank wanted to go back to the United States right after the fire, but because we had about 7 sellout shows on the continent, and the band made its money from the shows. We were paid per show. So for us to go home, we were going to each lose about $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000. I don't know exactly what it was. But we all sort of forced the issue and said, let's continue the tour. And we all sort of took a vote right after the fire in Montreux, and we went on to London, where we spent the week accumulating equipment of the Led Zeppelin and the Who and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and a bunch of these bands had loaned us pieces of equipment, and we had some rehearsals at the Rainbow, and eventually opened up at the Rainbow Theater, where at the end of the very first show of 4 sellouts, the tragedy of Frank being pushed into the orchestra pit now is history, and that ending of the Montreux fire, that week, 10 days in England preparing for the opening at the Rainbow and beginning a 7-city tour that would end, who knows what would have happened at the end of that. Might we have gone on and done Billy the Mountain as an animated feature, which was Frank's hope? Might we have dropped Devon totally from the show and found new areas to move into musically? We'll never know. All we can say is, with the tragedy of the Rainbow Theater, that era of the Mothers of Invention ends, and we leave the group, and the band reforms maybe 12, 14 months later, and Frank does an all-instrumental jazz album, maneuvering back to where he feels musically comfortable with the record Waka Jawaka.